The whole valley had been whispering about Seth Lawson's empty table for 3 years, and nobody had dared to do a single thing about it until the morning Harriet Vaughn rode into Caldwell, Kansas on a borrowed mule with nothing but a carpetbag, a iron-spined stubbornness, and a letter she hadn't finished reading yet. It was the spring of 1878, and Caldwell sat at the edge of everything. The last real town before the cattle trails turned into open wilderness, before the sky pressed down so low and so wide that a person could lose their whole sense of direction just by staring too long at the horizon. The town smelled like dust and horse and the faint sweetness of blooming prairie grass, and on the day Harriet arrived, the wind was carrying every scent sideways in long gusts that pulled at the brim of her brown traveling hat. She had come from Wichita, before that from St. Louis, and before that from a small Pennsylvania town where she had buried her mother in November and her father in February, and discovered that the house they had always lived in belonged to her father's brother by some arrangement she had never been told about. She was 26 years old, she was alone, and she was the kind of practical that comes not from being cold but from having had no other choice. She had read the advertisement in the Kansas paper 3 times before she answered it, and she had taken another week before she boarded the stage. She was not impulsive, she was deliberate, and she had decided very deliberately that Caldwell was where she was going to plant herself. The advertisement had been placed by a man named Henderson at the general store on behalf of Seth Lawson of the Lawson spread north of town. It had said, "Capable woman wanted, must be willing, large household. Fair wages and board. Inquire at Henderson's Dry Goods." It had not mentioned 12 sons. It had not mentioned that Seth Lawson had been a widower for 3 years. It had not mentioned the table. Harriet found out about all of it within 40 minutes of tying her mule to the post outside Henderson's. Mrs. Clara Henderson was a broad, kind woman with silver-threaded hair, and a habit of leaning across her counter when she had something important to say, which seemed to be most of the time. She took one look at Harriet's letter, one look at Harriet's face, and then she set both hands flat on the counter and said, "I am going to tell you things that Mr. Henderson chose not to include in that notice, because he is a good man, but he is also afraid of Seth Lawson turning that advertisement down, and I am not afraid of anything." Harriet set her carpetbag on the floor and gave the woman her full attention. "Seth Lawson," Clara Henderson said, "is 41 years old. He runs 4,000 acres north of here, beef cattle, and he does it with those boys of his because he hasn't hired ranch hands in 2 years on account of a bad season and some trouble with a neighbor I won't get into right now. He has 12 sons. The oldest is 19, the youngest just turned 5. Their mother, Eliza Lawson, God rest her, died of fever in the winter of '75. She was a remarkable woman." Clara paused, and something softened around her eyes. "The house has not been properly kept since. The boys eat standing up half the time, eating whatever they can scrounge, because Seth Lawson will not sit at that table where Eliza used to sit. He has not set a place at that table since the day she died. He eats in the barn more often than not. The whole valley knows it. It has become something of a wound that everyone can see. Those boys need someone who will feed them and keep that house, and maybe," Clara lowered her voice here, though they were alone, "maybe remind their father that the living still need tending." Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The advertisement mentioned fair wages. $2 a week in your own room," Clara said. "I will need 3, Harriet said. Clara smiled slowly. "I'll let Seth know." Seth Lawson came to Henderson's the next morning to collect feed supplies and found Harriet Vaughn sitting on the porch bench with her carpetbag at her feet, reading a book. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from real work and not from showing off, with dark hair gone silver at the temples and a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone the valley was built on. He wore a plain canvas coat and boots worn down at one heel, and he had the look of a man who had stopped noticing himself entirely. He stopped when he saw her. You the woman from the advertisement. He said. Harriet looked up from her book. She took in the whole of him in one steady gaze, the way she took in everything, not unkindly but thoroughly. I am, she said. Harriet Vaughn, you are Mr. Lawson. I am. He looked at her carpetbag, then back at her face. Mrs. Henderson says you want $3. I do. The advertisement said 2. The advertisement did not mention 12 sons, Harriet said pleasantly. Seth Lawson was quiet for a long moment. His eyes, which were a dark and complicated brown, moved across her face as if he were reading something in it, trying to decide whether to trust the words. Then he said, $3. You start today. He loaded her carpetbag into the wagon bed himself without asking, and they drove north out of Caldwell in a silence that was not quite comfortable but was not hostile either. The prairie opened up around them like a held breath. Red-winged blackbirds called from the tall grass on either side of the trail. The sky was the particular blue of early Kansas spring, thin and bright and enormous. After a mile or so, Harriet said, "Tell me their names." Seth glanced at her sideways. "Your sons," she said. "Tell me their names. I would rather know them before I meet them." Another pause. Then slowly, as if he were reading from some internal list he had not consulted in a while, Thomas is the oldest, 19. Then Daniel, 17, Marcus, 15, Eli and Henry, their twins, 14, Caleb, 12, James and Robert, they're 11 and 10. Then Noah, 8, Samuel, 7, little Ben, he's 6, and then William. William just turned 5. Harriet repeated each name quietly to herself, nodding. Seth watched her from the corner of his eye. "You won't remember all of them first day," he said, not unkindly. "I will," she said. She did. The Lawson house was a long, low-slung ranch house built from limestone and timber, with a porch that ran the full front length and a vegetable garden that had clearly once been cared for and was now a riot of old growth and weeds. Behind the house stood 2 large barns, a smokehouse, a root cellar, and a bunkhouse that the older boys used in summer. The yard between all of it was hard-packed earth, and on the morning Harriet arrived, 11 of the 12 sons were in it in various states of activity. Thomas mending a fence near the barn, Daniel and Marcus throwing a rope at each other with no evident purpose, the twins wrestling in the dirt, Caleb reading on the porch steps, James and Robert chasing something through the tall grass at the yard's edge, Noah and Samuel engaged in a heated and inaudible argument. Little Ben sitting on the water trough watching it all with enormous solemn eyes, and William small, serious-faced William, standing in the exact center of the yard holding a stick that was apparently very important. Seth brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down. The movement of the yard slowed, then stilled, as one by one the boys noticed the woman sitting on the wagon seat. Harriet climbed down herself before Seth could come around to help her. She stood in the yard and looked at the assembled faces looking at her, ranging from Thomas's guarded, measuring 19-year-old gaze to William's wide, wondering 5-year-old stare, and she felt the weight of what she had walked into settle over her shoulders like a yoke. Not unbearable, just honest. "Good morning," she said, addressing all of them at once, her voice clear and steady. "My name is Harriet Vaughn. I've come to help run this household. I expect we will get along very well, and I expect that by supper tonight we will all know where we stand with one another. Does anyone have a question before we begin?" A beat of silence. Then William, still holding his stick, said very seriously, "Can you make cornbread?" "I can make the best cornbread you have ever tasted," Harriet said. William considered this. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to whatever the stick required. Seth Lawson watched the whole exchange from 4 feet away, and something passed across his face quick, almost caught before it formed, that might, if a person were paying attention, have been the very faint beginning of hope. The state of the interior of the house was, to put it gently, a monument to good intentions overwhelmed by circumstance. The main room served as sitting room and dining room both, and it contained the table, a long, heavy oak table that could seat 14 if pressed, hand-built, beautiful even under the layer of neglect that had accumulated over 3 years of nobody sitting down to use it properly. It had 13 chairs. One of them, at the head closest to the kitchen door, sat slightly apart from the others, as if it had been pushed back and never pulled in again. Harriet stood in the doorway of the main room for a long moment, looking at that table. Thomas had come in behind her, watching. He was tall like his father, with his mother's coloring, lighter eyes, light brown hair. He had a wariness about him that was not unfriendly, more like a man who had learned to measure things before committing to them. "He doesn't sit there," Thomas said quietly. "He hasn't since Mama died. We've all just sort of stopped being the place where we eat." "Where do you eat?" Harriet asked. Thomas shrugged. "Standing at the kitchen counter mostly, or outside." "Pa eats in the barn." Harriet looked at the table again. Then she turned to Thomas and said, "Will you help me carry water in from the pump? I'd like to wash this table down properly before supper." Thomas blinked. "Yes, ma'am. And I'll need to know where the linen is kept, if there is any, and whether there is a decent iron somewhere in this house." "There's a linen chest in the back bedroom," Thomas said slowly. "It was Mama's. It hasn't been opened." "All right," Harriet said. "Then we'll open it." The first week at the Lawson Ranch was the kind of week that reshapes a person or reshapes a place, which amounts to the same thing. Harriet worked from before sunrise to well after dark, and she worked with the focused efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime making order out of disorder without ever making a production of it. She scoured the kitchen, restocked the larder by sending Daniel and Marcus into town with a list and exact money, organized the root cellar, mended the vegetable garden with the help of Noah and Samuel, who turned out to be enthusiastic if occasionally counterproductive gardeners, and systematically worked her way through every room in the house with soap, water, and the quiet determination of a woman who understands that a clean house is an act of love made visible. She cooked 3 meals a day, real meals, not just what could be thrown together quickly, but meals that required sitting down to eat. The first morning she made a proper breakfast. She set 12 places at the long oak table and put the food in the center and stood at the kitchen door and said in a carrying voice that it was ready. There was a shuffling hesitation. The boys were not accustomed to being summoned to that table. They filed in slowly, eyeing it with a mix of unfamiliarity and something that looked almost like grief, and they sat down in an arrangement that had its own unconscious hierarchy, Thomas at one end, then the others according to age, trailing down to little William, who had to climb into his chair and who immediately reached for the cornbread. Seth was not there. Nobody said anything about it, but every boy glanced once at the empty chair at the head of the table. Harriet said nothing about it either. She served the meal. She sat down herself and ate. She spoke to the boys with the easy, natural interest of a woman who genuinely wanted to know them, asking Thomas about the fence repair, asking the twins about the wrestling match she had witnessed the day before, asking Caleb what he was reading, listening to Noah and Samuel's competing accounts of a snake they had found in the south field. The meal stretched long, longer than any meal at that table had in years, because the boys did not want to leave. After breakfast, Harriet took a plate to the barn. Seth was there, working on a piece of harness, sitting on an overturned bucket in the cool dim of the large barn's interior. He looked up when she came in. His expression was complicated. "I brought you breakfast," Harriet said. She set the plate on a nearby barrel without fanfare. "The boys ate at the table this morning. It went well." Seth looked at the plate. He looked at her. He said nothing. "I'm not going to push you," Harriet said, meeting his gaze with the same directness she met everything. "That is your business and your grief, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the boys need a table, Mr. Lawson. They need to see someone at the head of it. When you're ready, the chair will be there." She left him with the plate and went back to the house. He ate the meal, because when she came to collect the plate an hour later it was clean. He didn't say anything about it. But when she brought him lunch that afternoon, he had moved from the bucket to a proper stool, and he watched her as she set the second plate down with an expression she couldn't quite read yet, something that lived between gratitude and resistance and something else entirely. It was the twins, Eli and Henry, who first told her about their mother. They were 14, and they tended to move through the world as a unit, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's movements in the way of twins who have never been separated. They found Harriet in the garden on the fourth afternoon and sat on the fence rail and watched her work for a while before Eli said, "Mama used to do that exactly the same way, same rows." Harriet sat back on her heels. "Tell me about her." They did. In the way of children telling a story that is both precious and painful, they told her about Eliza Lawson, who had been a schoolteacher before she married Seth, who had known the name of every prairie plant, who had a singing voice that could stop a room, who had kept the house and the table and the family together with what the twins described as a kind of invisible thread that had snapped when she died and left everyone loose and floating. "Pa loved her so much," Henry said, and then looked away across the fields. "He just sort of stopped after." "He didn't stop," Harriet said gently. "He kept this ranch running, kept all of you fed and housed and working. That's not stopping. He stopped being," Eli searched for the word, "present, like he's here but not here." Harriet understood that perfectly. She had watched her own father do the same thing after her mother became ill, still moving through the world, still performing the functions of living, but evacuated from himself, the real person somewhere behind his eyes where nobody could reach him. "He will come back," she said, though she was not entirely sure she believed it when she said it. She was speaking it like a prayer, or like a seed placed in ground you hope is good. The second Sunday at the ranch, which was the 14th day of Harriet's employment, something happened that nobody had planned and that everyone afterward would point to as the day things began to shift. It was evening, after supper, a real supper that all 12 boys had eaten at the table, a Sunday supper that Harriet had made into something special with a roasted chicken and 2 kinds of pie, because she believed firmly that Sunday supper should be special enough to make the whole week worth having. The younger boys were in bed. The older ones were drifting toward the bunkhouse. Harriet was in the main room, mending by lamplight, when Seth came in from outside. He stopped in the doorway of the main room. He looked at the table, which was cleared but set. She kept it set now, plates and cups arranged as if ready for a meal at any moment, because she had decided that a table permanently laid was a permanent invitation. He looked at the chairs. He looked at the lamp burning on the sideboard, the light it cast over the whole room. He had clearly intended to pass through. He did not pass through. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, and then, as if pulled by something he was not consciously directing, he walked to the head of the table and put his hand on the back of the chair that had been empty for 3 years. Harriet kept mending. She did not look up. She did not make this moment larger than it needed to be. Seth stood there for a while. Then he said, without quite looking at her, "Her name was Eliza." "I know," Harriet said quietly. "The boys have told me about her. She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Seth said. He was quiet again. His hand was still on the back of the chair. "I built this table for her, before the boys, before all of this. When it was just the 2 of us, first year of the ranch. She said she wanted a table big enough for a full life." His voice was low and even, not breaking exactly, but thin. "I didn't know then that it would mean 12 sons. She always said she had plenty of room." Harriet set down her mending. She looked at him now, at the whole weight of the man standing at the head of his own table, 3 years of grief worn into the set of his shoulders like weather into limestone. "She was right," Harriet said. "She left plenty of room." Seth looked at her then directly, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not yet love. It was too early and too raw for that, but it was the recognition of one person by another, the peculiar and precious human sense of being seen by someone who is not going to flinch at what they find. He pulled out the chair. He sat down. He had not sat at the head of that table in 3 years. He sat there now in the lamplight, with the supper things cleared and the room quiet. And after a moment Harriet picked up her mending again, and the 2 of them occupied the same space in a silence that had become, without either of them deciding it, companionable. She brought him coffee. He said thank you. That was all, but it was a great deal. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Harriet found herself settling into with a comfort that surprised her. The ranch was hard work and never-ending work, and 12 boys were 12 different personalities requiring 12 different approaches, but she had discovered that she loved the particularity of it, the specific quality of each boy's character, the way the family was not a single entity but a constellation, each point distinct. Thomas she had come to think of as a young man in the process of becoming something serious and good, steady, reliable, a little formal with her at first but thawing steadily. Daniel was the one who made everyone laugh, quick with a joke, quick with a grin, occasionally quick with a shortcut that had to be redirected. Marcus was quieter than either of his older brothers, bookish in a way that seemed incongruous on a cattle ranch, but that Seth apparently accommodated without comment, keeping a small shelf of books above the kitchen mantel. The twins were the twins, inseparable, occasionally maddening, full of a joy that was purely physical, always moving, always competing, but with a generosity between them that manifested as each constantly pushing the other forward. Caleb was the reader of the family, the one most likely to be found in a corner with a book and most likely to have a thoughtful question ready. James and Robert were best friends in the way that brothers close in age can be, sharing secrets and schemes and a nearly identical sense of humor. Noah and Samuel, the ones she had first watched arguing about a snake, were the talkers, endlessly curious, endlessly verbal, and they had adopted Harriet as their primary audience within the first week. Little Ben was serious and watchful, like a small old man, and he had developed the habit of coming to sit near Harriet when she was working, not talking, just present, as if her presence was something he needed to verify regularly. And William with his stick, William with his solemn 5-year-old dignity, had decided within the first 48 hours that Harriet was his particular favorite person in the world, and he expressed this by following her everywhere she went, including places she would have preferred to be alone, and by pressing flowers and interesting rocks, and once a frog into her hands as gifts. She kept all the rocks on the kitchen windowsill. She released the frog back to the yard while William watched approvingly. It was Noah who first noticed, in the matter-of-fact way of 8-year-olds, that his father had started eating at the table again. Noah said this at breakfast one morning, 3 weeks into Harriet's time at the ranch, with the mild wonder of someone noting a change in the weather. "Pa came in last night for supper," he announced to the table. He sat in his chair. The table went quiet. Then all the boys looked at Seth, who was, in fact, sitting at his chair at the head of the table with a cup of coffee, eating breakfast, and who met the collective gaze of his sons with the composure of a man who is acutely aware of being watched and is choosing not to acknowledge it. "Eat your eggs," he said. They ate their eggs. But Harriet, bringing more coffee to the table, saw Thomas catch her eye across the room, and the look he gave her was one of such open, unguarded gratitude that she had to look away before her expression said too much. The thing between Harriet and Seth grew slowly, the way things grow in that country, not in a straight line upward but in all directions at once, underground and above, quiet and persistent. It was not declared and it was not rushed. It was built in the accumulation of small moments, each unremarkable on its own but collectively something that neither of them could ignore forever. It was built in the evenings after supper when the boys were occupied or in bed and Seth would come to sit at the table while Harriet finished the kitchen work, and they would talk not always about significant things, sometimes about the cattle, sometimes about the garden, sometimes about whatever book Marcus was working through and had left on the kitchen table, sometimes about nothing at all, just words filling the quiet space of the evening in a way that felt natural and right. It was built in the morning conversations at the barn when she brought him coffee before the day started, and he would tell her what needed doing, and she would tell him what she needed for the house and kitchen, practical exchanges that somewhere along the way had begun to include other things. What he thought about a problem she had noticed, what she had heard from Clara Henderson in town, whether the south field had water enough, what the sky was doing. It was built in the afternoon. She found him fixing the garden fence she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks earlier, not because anyone had asked him to, but because he had heard her say it needed doing and he had done it without comment. And when she came out and saw him there with his tools and thanked him, he had said only, "The posts were rotten," and gone back to work. But he was there doing it, having thought of it, which told her more than the words. It was built in the evening, 6 weeks after she arrived, when a storm came roaring in from the northwest with the particular violence of Kansas spring weather, all wind and lightning and the green-tinged sky that meant serious intent, and every boy in the house had to be accounted for, and the animals secured, and the shutters latched, and Seth and Harriet moved through all of this with the practiced synchrony of people who have been working alongside each other long enough to anticipate, she knowing which boys to send where. He moving through the preparations with a focus and efficiency that left no room for panic. When it was all done and the storm was crashing overhead and 12 boys were inside and secure and the animals were in the barn, Seth and Harriet stood on the porch watching the lightning move across the plain, and he said quietly under the sound of the rain, "I don't know how I managed before you." She did not answer immediately. She watched the lightning, feeling the warmth of the words settle into her. Then she said, "You managed fine. You kept everything going." "That's not the same thing as managed," Seth said. She looked at him and he looked at her, and both of them looked away at the same moment, back at the storm, but the night had changed. Something that had been building quietly had crested. It was Clara Henderson who told Harriet, during a trip to town in the 7th week, that people were talking. She said it not unkindly but as information, with the pragmatic directness that characterized everything Clara did. "They are saying you're good for that family," Clara said, folding fabric behind the counter. "And they are saying some other things too, which are not unkind but are the things people say when a woman is living in a man's house." Harriet was quiet for a moment, looking at a bolt of blue calico without really seeing it. "I am employed there," she said. "Of course," Clara said pleasantly. "I am his housekeeper." "Of course," Clara said again, in the same pleasant tone, which made it clear she was not arguing the point but was also not entirely agreeing with it. Harriet set down the calico. "Is there something specific you are trying to tell me, Mrs. Henderson?" Clara leaned on the counter. "I'm trying to tell you that Seth Lawson has not looked at a woman since Eliza died, and the whole valley has noticed that he is looking at you. And I am trying to tell you that this valley is in the business of other people's affairs and will have opinions, and I think you should know that before you are surprised by them." Harriet considered this. "What are the opinions?" "Mixed," Clara said honestly. "Some think it's the best thing that's happened to that family since Eliza died. Some think he should wait longer. A few uncharitable souls think a woman in her circumstances," she paused delicately, "ought not to be living in a widower's house regardless of the official arrangement." "My circumstances," Harriet said evenly. "Alone, from out of state, no family here," Clara said. "You know how people talk." Harriet did know. She had spent her whole life in proximity to how people talk. She lifted her chin slightly in the way that she did when she was deciding not to be bothered by something. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I'm telling you because I like you," Clara said. "And because I have watched Seth Lawson eat his grief like a meal he's had to finish for 3 years. And whatever it is you've done up on that ranch has changed something. I don't think it's only the cooking." Harriet bought her calico and her other supplies and drove back to the ranch, and the whole way she turned the conversation over in her mind with the same thoroughness she brought to everything. She was not a woman who spent much time in self-deception. She knew what she felt, had known it for several weeks, had been deliberately setting it aside each morning and each evening because she had come here for employment, because she had needed a place and a purpose, because she had not intended to fall in love with a widowed cattle rancher with 12 sons. But the prairie does not consult intentions when deciding what to grow. It was Thomas who came to her that same evening, just before supper, finding her in the garden while there was still light. He had clearly been working up to saying something, carrying it around all day by the look of him. He stood at the garden gate and said without preamble, because Thomas was not a person who circled around things, "I want you to know that we, all of us, the boys, we think you're the best thing that's happened here in a long time. I wanted to say it because nobody else is going to say it directly." Harriet looked at him from her knees, a handful of weeds in her hand. "That is very kind of you, Thomas." "It's not kindness," he said. "It's just the truth. Ben sleeps through the night now. He hasn't done that in 2 years. Sam and Noah aren't fighting near as much. William," he stopped, and something crossed his face that was more complicated. "William calls you by your first name. Pa told him he should say Miss Vaughn. William said he would try, but he keeps forgetting. I don't think he actually forgets." Harriet smiled at the weeds in her hand. "I don't mind," she said quietly. "And Pa," Thomas said, and he stopped again, this time for longer. "Pa, as I haven't seen Pa look like that since Mama was alive, like he remembers what things are for." Harriet was quiet. "I'm not saying anything that ought to be said," Thomas said, looking off at the fields in the way of his father. "I'm just saying, if things were ever to, we would all be glad." He stopped, clearly feeling that he had either said too much or not quite enough, and then he turned and went back to the barn. Harriet stayed in the garden a little longer than she needed to. The sky was going orange over the flat edge of the world, the way it did in Kansas, in that violent, peaceable beauty that the landscape reserved for its best evenings. She sat in the good dirt with her hands full of weeds, and she let herself feel what she felt fully, without trimming it into something more manageable. She loved him. She had been moving toward loving him since the wagon ride from town, when he told her his sons' names in the patient, private voice of a man who had not spoken them aloud as a list in a very long time. She had been moving toward loving him in every evening conversation, every morning exchange, every quiet hour they had occupied together. She loved the gravity of him, the careful way he moved through the world, the way he looked at his sons, even the distant, abstracted way he had looked at them through his grief, with a love so large and so helpless that it had no vocabulary, only action. She loved his hands, which were the hands of someone who built and tended and repaired. She loved the way he had sat in that chair, that first night, as if sitting down was the bravest thing he'd done in years. She gathered the weeds and went inside and began making supper. It was at supper, 3 days after Thomas's conversation and 10 days after the trip to town, that the thing happened which everyone afterward agreed was the turning point, though turning points rarely announce themselves as such. The supper was ordinary beef and potatoes and beans and cornbread, the reliable workhorses of a ranch kitchen. All 13 of them were at the table, which had become the daily norm now, Seth at his head, and all 12 boys arranged down the sides, Harriet at the far end, which had become her place as naturally as if she had always sat there. There was the usual noise of 12 boys at a table, disputes over the cornbread, Robert explaining something complicated about a rope to James, Noah contradicting Samuel about the height of the water in the South Creek, little William carefully and deliberately buttering his bread in exact strokes as if it were a task requiring complete attention. Seth was watching William with the expression he wore sometimes when he thought nobody was observing him, a full, unguarded tenderness that was both wholly characteristic and almost unbearably painful to see, because it was the same face he turned on all of them, the face that said, "I would wreck myself entirely to keep you safe." And that kind of love, offered 12 times over, had left him with very little left for anything else for a very long time. He looked up from William, and he looked down the length of the table, and his eyes found Harriet. She was listening to Ben, who was beside her, telling her something quietly while the rest of the table roared on around them, her head bent toward the small boy, her whole attention given to him the way she gave her whole attention to whichever boy was speaking. She had a habit of doing this, of stopping entirely for whoever needed her, of making the person in front of her feel like the only person in the room. It was not a performance. It was just her nature. Seth watched her for a long moment. He watched the way she touched Ben's shoulder when the boy finished saying whatever he was saying, the small confirming press of her hand. He watched the way she looked up from Ben and caught William reaching for her cornbread without asking, and gave William a look of such gentle mock severity that the boy dissolved into giggles, and then she laughed too, and the laugh was the unreserved kind, not careful or held back, just honest. He had not heard a woman laugh in this house in 3 years. After supper, he asked her to walk with him. He said it simply, standing in the yard with the dishes done and the younger boys in bed, and the older boys occupied elsewhere, the evening cool and starthic overhead. He said, "Will you walk with me?" Not quite a question, and she said yes, and they walked down the path toward the south field in the dark, not far, just far enough that the sounds of the ranch fell behind them, and there was only the grass and the stars and the good cool smell of the night. He did not begin speaking immediately. He walked beside her with the deliberate pace of a man deciding how to say a thing he has not said in a very long time, and she let him take his time because she had learned that about him, that he thought before he spoke, and that the thinking was not absence but preparation. Finally he said, "I am going to say something that I have no particular right to say." "I think you have whatever rights you give yourself," Harriet said. A pause. "I was very sure," he said slowly, "when Eliza died that the particular capacity for what she and I had was something that happened once, that it was not the kind of thing you found twice, that it was unique to her and to us, and that asking for it a second time would be asking for something that wasn't there." Harriet walked beside him and said nothing, listening. "I am finding," Seth said, "that I was wrong about that." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and they stood in the south field in the dark, two people under a Kansas sky full of more stars than most of the world gets, and the thing that had been building for 8 weeks was present now between them, visible even in the dark. "Seth," she said, and his name in her voice was something it had not been before, not Mr. Lawson, not careful, just his name, the way you say the name of someone whose nearness you have come to need. "I know it soon," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite pain but was the adjacent territory. "I know what it looks like, what people will say." "I don't care what people say," Harriet said. "You should," he said. "For your sake." "Seth," she said again, more firmly, "I came to this ranch to work. I did not come expecting anything, but I have been here 2 months and I know your sons better than some fathers know their children. I know that you are a man who builds tables big enough for a full life. I know that you sat in that chair 3 years after your grief told you not to because something in you was stronger than your grief." She paused. "I know that I have been paying close attention, and that paying close attention to you has led me somewhere I did not plan to go." The silence was long. "I am 41 years old," he said. "I have 12 sons. I am not an easy thing to take on." "I have been taking you on for 2 months," Harriet said. "I think I know what I'm doing." He looked at her in the dark. She looked at him. And then he reached out and took her hand, which was the most careful and deliberate and utterly certain gesture, and she felt it move through her like water finding level, like settling, like coming to rest after a long distance. "I would like very much," he said, his voice steady but barely, "to find out what the next chapter looks like." "I would like that too," she said. He brought her hand up and held it for a moment, and then he said, quietly and honestly, "I'm going to need more time, before anything formal. I want to be sure, for your sake, that I am ready to offer what ought to be offered and not just what I want to offer." She understood that completely. She had not expected a gallop. She had expected the pace of someone who meant what he said. "Take your time," she said. "I am not going anywhere." They walked back to the house in the dark, side by side, not quite holding hands anymore but close enough that their shoulders touched with each step, and overhead the stars burned with that absolute prairie intensity, undimmed by anything man-made, as clear as intention. What followed was a courtship of the most genuine kind, which is to say it was practical and slow and full of the texture of real life. Seth did not transform overnight into a man who made sweeping declarations. He was who he was, steady, deliberate, communicating in actions before words, building everything on foundations he tested before he stood on them. But he was present now in a way that was different from before. He sat at the table every meal. He sought her out in the evenings. He asked her opinion on ranch decisions, not as a formality, but because he genuinely wanted to know what she thought, and he listened to her answers with the focused attention of someone who takes the other person seriously. The boys watched all of this with the collective awareness of 12 people who have spent their whole lives in close proximity and know everything that happens in their house. Their responses were various. Thomas was quietly, deeply approving, in the way he did everything without theater but completely. Daniel made jokes about it that were affectionate rather than cutting, which was his way of welcoming things. Marcus pretended not to notice, which was Marcus's way of caring very much. The twins were openly delighted and kept nudging each other whenever Seth and Harriet were in the same room, which Seth eventually addressed by telling them directly to mind themselves, which they did for about 24 hours. Caleb asked Harriet one afternoon whether she liked his father, straightforwardly and without embarrassment, and she told him yes, straightforwardly and without embarrassment, and Caleb said good and went back to his book. James and Robert treated the whole situation with the good-natured indifference of boys whose primary concerns were elsewhere, though they were uniformly nicer to Harriet after their father began courting her, which she noted with affection. Noah and Samuel discussed it with each other at some length. She could hear them, and the conclusion they reached audible through the kitchen wall one evening was that it was a good idea because Miss Harriet knew how to make the bread rise properly, and their mother had always said that a woman who knew bread was worth keeping. Ben continued his quiet, watchful presence at her side, and she thought that whatever his small self understood about the situation, he was comfortable with it in the way of people who process things deeply and don't need to name them. And William simply knew that Harriet was his person, and that she and his father both liked him, and that this was the correct arrangement of the universe, and he proceeded accordingly. 6 weeks after the walk in the South Field, a man from the next spread over, a man named Garrett, who ran cattle on the adjoining property, and had been watching the Lawson spread with interest for a year, rode over, and managed to position himself in Harriet's path near the barn, and suggested, with a smile that was confident in a way she found immediately unpleasant, that a woman of her apparent capabilities might find better employment in town, or perhaps at his own place. Harriet was carrying a bucket of milk at the time. She set it down, looked at the man, and said, "I am not looking for different employment." "I pay well," Garrett said. "I am not discussing wages," Harriet said. "I am telling you I am not looking for different employment." Garrett's eyes moved over her in a way that she had encountered before, the measuring look of a man who thinks a woman's refusal is a starting position rather than a conclusion. He said something further about her situation, her prospects, Seth's situation, that was framed as practical advice but was intended as pressure. Seth came out of the barn at this point. He had not heard the conversation, but he saw the set of Harriet's shoulders which he had learned to read accurately, and he came and stood beside her without a word. Garrett's expression changed. "Garrett," Seth said pleasantly. "Lawson," Garrett said, his tone shifting. "I think you've said whatever you came to say," Seth said, still pleasant, absolutely immovable. Garrett looked between them, recalculated, and rode off without another word. Seth watched him go. Then he looked at Harriet, and there was something in his face that was not quite anger but was certainly not nothing. "What did he say?" Seth asked. Harriet told him the substance of it. Seth's jaw tightened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have made this clear some time ago. I have not been," he stopped. "I have not been fair to you in that regard, about what this is, about your position here." "You have been perfectly fair," she said. "I have been careful," he said. Careful can look like fair, but it is not the same thing. He looked at her with that direct, honest gaze of his. "Harriet, I love you. I have been sure of it for several weeks, and I have been waiting until I was certain I could say it the right way with everything that ought to come with it." He pulled a breath. "I am certain. And I would very much like, if you are willing, for this to become a permanent arrangement, for you to become my wife, for the boys to have what they have found in you, and for me to have it too." Properly, the bucket of milk was still on the ground between them. The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horses. In the distance, someone, it sounded like Noah, was shouting at someone who sounded like Samuel. "Yes," Harriet said, "I am willing." The relief that moved through him was visible, like a man who has been holding something heavy finally setting it down. He reached out and took her face in both hands, large, careful hands, and he kissed her with the deliberate tenderness of a man who does not do things by halves. Behind the barn, the sound of boots retreating rapidly suggested that at least 2 of the older boys had been within earshot. At supper that evening, Seth stood at the head of the table after the meal was eaten and told his sons, in the straightforward way of a man who does not think his children need to be managed but do need to be respected, that he had asked Harriet to marry him and she had said yes. The reaction was, to put it precisely, significant. Thomas stood up from his chair and reached across the table and shook his father's hand, and his face said more than his grip did. Daniel shouted something that was enthusiastic but only partially intelligible. Marcus smiled, slowly and completely, the smile of a boy who had been waiting a long time for something good. The twins erupted. Caleb looked up from the table with an expression of absolute satisfaction and said, "Obviously." James and Robert cheered with equal enthusiasm and immediately got into an argument about who had seen it coming first. Noah said, "I knew it," to Samuel, who said, "So did I," to which Noah said, "No, you didn't," to which Samuel said, "Yes, I did," and this carried on for some time. Ben left his chair, walked to Harriet's end of the table, and put his arms around her waist without saying anything, his face pressed to her side, and she put her hand on his head and held on. And William, sitting in his chair with his very serious 5-year-old dignity, looked at his father and then at Harriet and said, "Good. Does this mean Harriet lives here now always?" "Always," Seth said. William nodded, satisfied, and returned to his cornbread. They were married in June of 1878 in the Caldwell church, a simple ceremony because that was what suited them both, nothing theatrical, nothing for show, only the true words said in front of the people who mattered. The 12 boys were all there, cleaned and brushed to varying degrees of success. William had lost one boot buckle somewhere between the ranch and town, and was wearing it slightly crooked, which Harriet had noticed and decided not to fix because it was William and it was perfect. Clara Henderson attended and cried without apology. The minister was a man named Caldwell who had known Seth since before the boys, who shook Seth's hand afterward with the two-handed grip of genuine feeling. Harriet wore the blue calico she had bought at Henderson's. She had made the dress herself in the evenings over 3 weeks, in the quiet hours after the boys were in bed, and it fit her exactly as she wanted it to. She had no family present, which was the only sadness of the day, no mother, no father, no sister to stand beside her. But she had Clara Henderson, and she had 12 boys in a row who were hers, and she had Seth Lawson taking her hands at the altar with a look on his face that was both composed and broken open, a man fully present in a moment he had not been sure he would ever want again. When the vows were said and the ring was on, Seth bent and kissed her, and behind them in the pew, quiet but present, 12 boys watched their father become someone new and also become himself again, and the two things were not contradictory. The first year of their marriage was not a smooth downhill after the climb of the courtship. Real life is not like that. There were difficult mornings, weeks when the ranch pressed hard on all of them, times when Seth's grief surfaced unexpectedly, a sound, a smell, a certain quality of light, and he would go quiet and absent in the old way, and Harriet had to learn the difference between giving him space and letting him drift too far. She learned it through honest conversation, through the patience she had not always felt but had decided to embody, through the slow work of two people building a shared language for the complicated things. Thomas, at 19 and heading toward 20, began to take on more of the ranch management in a natural handover that Seth encouraged. The boy had grown into a man over the year, and watching it happen, watching Seth step back and let Thomas step forward with pride rather than loss, was one of the things Harriet loved most about her husband, his capacity to let his children become themselves without clinging. Daniel, at 17, was the one who gave her the most trouble and also the most joy. He had a talent for finding the edge of every situation and leaning over it to see what was there, which was occasionally alarming and ultimately endearing. And she handled him by treating him as the intelligent person he was while being absolutely unmovable about the things that mattered. And he responded to this with a respect he did not always show and an affection that was genuine under the jokes. Marcus applied for and was accepted to study in Wichita, a development that surprised no one who had seen the boy's nose in a book for years, and that pleased Seth quietly and deeply, and that Harriet wrote about in a letter to Clara Henderson, saying that Marcus deserved every good thing that was coming to him. The younger boys continued their education. Harriet had established a proper schedule for lessons in the first months, working with Marcus before his departure, and then with Caleb, who had a gift for teaching that he had not yet named. And she pushed the ranch community for proper schooling arrangements with Clara Henderson's support, until a teacher was hired to hold school in Caldwell 3 days a week, which was the practical reality of the time and the place. The table, that long oak table Seth had built before the boys, before everything, was full every morning and every evening, 13 places. Seth at the head, Harriet at the other end, boys along both sides, the whole loud, generous, crowded, imperfect, full life of a family that had found its way back to the surface. In the late autumn of 1878, on a cold night when the wind was doing what it did, and all the boys were inside, and the fire was going, and Seth was sitting at the table reading by the lamp, and Harriet was mending nearby, she told him she thought they were going to have a child. He put down the book. He looked at her with an expression she would keep in her memory for the rest of her life, not shocked, not surprised exactly, something more like the arrival of something long hoped for in a part of himself he hadn't known was still hoping. "You're sure?" he said. "Fairly sure," she said. He stood up from the table and crossed the room to her and took her face in his hands exactly as he had the day he proposed, and he kissed her once, and then held her for a long moment without speaking, his arms around her, her head against his chest, the fire crackling, the wind outside. "A 13th, he said quietly, with a kind of wondering that was not calculation but pure feeling. "A 13th, she confirmed. Thomas was the first of the boys to know, because Thomas was the one who noticed things, and what he noticed was that Harriet was occasionally unwell in the mornings in a way she had not been before, and he put it together quietly and came to her in the kitchen one morning when the younger boys were not yet down and said, gently and without pressure, "Is everything all right?" And she had looked at him and understood that he knew, and she told him yes, and his face went through several things in quick succession: concern, realization, happiness, and something that was both older and younger than any of those. The face of a boy who has grown up in a house where the absence of a mother is a wound you learn to live around, being told that the house will have more life in it, not less. "I'm glad," Thomas said, and then more quietly, "She would have been glad too." "I believe that," Harriet said. The child was born in July of 1879, a hot summer night, Clara Henderson serving as midwife with her customary efficient authority, Seth in the hall with 12 sons in various states of anxiety ranging from Thomas's controlled pacing to William's complete incomprehension of what was happening and why it was taking so long. The child was a boy, a 13th son, red-faced and loud from the first moment, already asserting himself in the Lawson tradition. Seth was brought in and he held the baby and he looked at Harriet, who was exhausted and luminous, and he said nothing for a long time because there was too much to say. They named him Elias. a name that echoed both Eliza and the ongoing life she had started, the thread that kept running. When little Elias was brought into the main room the next morning and placed briefly in the center of the table so that all 12 brothers could see him, Harriet had thought this was perhaps too theatrical, but Seth had suggested it with a quiet certainty, and she had trusted him. The reactions across 12 faces were a catalog of humanity. Awe, bemusement, delight, the twins nudging each other, Caleb examining the baby with scientific attention, Noah and Samuel immediately, and quietly beginning an argument about what he would be like when he could walk, Ben staring with that deep solemn regard he gave to everything important, and William, perched on his chair, looking at the baby with the gravity of a person encountering something that changes the shape of the universe. "He's very small," William said. "You were smaller," Seth said. William considered this dubious. "I don't think so," he said. The table laughed, all of it, 12 boys and 2 parents, the full rolling laughter of a family that is alive and present and has found its way back to itself. The years that followed built on themselves in the way that good years do. The ranch grew steadily under the combined work of Seth and his sons, and the careful eye of Harriet, who turned out to have a head for the financial and logistical side of things that Seth acknowledged with both gratitude and zero false pride. He was happy to understand something better with her help, and never pretended otherwise. Thomas took the North Range over formally when he turned 21, running it with an authority that earned the respect of the other ranchers in the valley. Daniel turned his energy toward breaking horses, which turned out to be exactly the right channel for his particular temperament, and by the time he was 20, he had a reputation across 3 counties. Marcus came back from Wichita with ideas about soil management that he planted in Seth, the way Harriet had planted everything in that garden persistently, with faith in the ground, and which eventually made the South Field the most productive acreage on the ranch. The twins, Eli and Henry, remained inseparable into adulthood, working the cattle together as they had worked everything, as a unit, anticipating each other, competing constantly, achieving more together than either could alone. Caleb, the reader, became the family's liaison with the world beyond the ranch, corresponding with newspapers, and eventually writing a column for the Caldwell paper about life on the plains that had people in as far away as Chicago reading about the Lawson spread without knowing it. James and Robert, growing into their middle teens, became Harriet's particular allies in the kitchen garden, developing an enthusiasm for the growing side of things that surprised everyone including themselves, and Harriet nurtured this with the careful attention she brought to everything worth growing. Noah and Samuel's perpetual arguing refined itself over the years into a partnership that functioned by way of constant debate. They would disagree their way to any solution, which was inefficient but remarkably effective. Ben, quiet, watchful Ben, grew into a young man of great stillness and great depth, and it was Ben who kept the horses, who had a gift with them that was closer to language than technique, a way of being near an animal that communicated without force and produced trust. William, growing up with Elias toddling behind him, took his role as older brother with a gravity that was entirely characteristic of him, teaching Elias everything he knew about sticks and frogs and the proper buttering of bread. And Elias grew loud and curious and full of the particular energy of a child who has 12 older brothers, and therefore an enormous amount of input on every subject. He looked like Seth around the jaw and eyes, and like Harriet in everything else, and he had inherited from both of them a quality of stubborn, honest attention to the world that made him, even as a very small child, someone who paid close and independent notice to things. In the spring of 1881, when Elias was not yet 2, Harriet told Seth she was expecting again. This time he was not in the hall for hours. He had learned, after the first time, that the best thing he could do was be in the room where she was, and so he was sitting nearby, within reach, present in the direct and uncomplicated way of a man who understands that love is often just the willingness to stay close. The second child was born in November of 1881, at the beginning of winter, and this time it was a girl. They named her Clara for Mrs. Henderson, who was so overcome when she heard that she closed the general store for an afternoon and went home to have a private cry, and came back the next day with a quilt she had started 6 months earlier that nobody had asked about. The ranch and the house and the family that Harriet had walked into that particular life, that full, difficult, beautiful, loud, demanding, surprising life, had become so entirely her own that she could no longer remember, not really remember, the weight of the life before it. She remembered it factually. The small Pennsylvania town, her parents, the house that was not hers, the paper with the advertisement, the mule she had ridden into Caldwell. She remembered it the way you remember a map of a country you no longer live in. The knowledge was there, but the residency had ended. One afternoon in the spring of 1882, while Clara was asleep and Elias was in the yard under Thomas's loose supervision, and the table was being set by Noah and Samuel, who were, of course, arguing about the exact placement of the forks, Harriet stood in the kitchen with Seth and looked out the window at the yard and the fields beyond it and the great flat sky over everything, and felt, in that full and settling way that is different from happiness because it is quieter and does not require anything to confirm it, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Seth came to stand beside her, following her gaze out the window. He had a cup of coffee in each hand. He gave her one. "What are you looking at?" he said. "Everything," she said. He looked out the window for a moment. Then, "It's a lot of everything." "It is," she said. "It's just about the right amount." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. And outside the window the prairie ran its full distance in every direction. And the boys were doing whatever the boys were doing. And in the yard, Elias had found a stick and was carrying it with the same absolute serious purposefulness as his brother William had always done. And Seth watched this and laughed quietly into her hair. "Another one with a stick," he said. "It must be the yard," she said. He held her closer and she let him, and for a while they just stood there in the kitchen of the house he had built and she had reclaimed, watching the world of the ranch move through its afternoon in the particular gold of a Kansas spring, everything alive and in progress, nothing finished yet. Caleb's column in the Caldwell paper, published later that year, described the Lawson Ranch without naming it, though everyone who read it knew exactly what and who he was describing. It described a table, long and oak and hand-built, large enough for a full life. It described 12 sons and a father who had come back to himself. It described a woman who had arrived with a carpetbag and an iron stubbornness, and had set the 13th place at a table that had been empty too long, and in so doing had set something much larger and harder to measure back in its proper place. He wrote that the valley had watched it happen, and had nothing to say about it, except that it was the truest thing they had seen in a long time, which was saying something in a part of the world where true things were the only currency that held its value. When Seth read the column, he was quiet for a moment, the way he always was when something arrived that was too good to receive quickly. Then he folded the paper carefully and set it on the shelf above the kitchen mantel, between Marcus's old reading books, where it stayed. The table, that long oak table, saw more years of full use. It saw Thomas's wedding, when he brought home a woman named Alma who arrived with a quiet confidence and a dry humor that fit the Lawson household like a key in a well-made lock, and who Harriet loved immediately and completely. It saw Daniel's eventual settling, which was late and dramatic, and involved a woman named Rosa, who was the daughter of one of the cattle buyers from Abilene, and who matched Daniel's energy with her own in a way that was occasionally alarming and consistently wonderful. It saw Marcus return from Wichita with a degree and eventually a wife of his own, a woman named Pearl who shared his love of books and his love of the land in equal measure, and who fit the South field she helped him improve as naturally as the crop itself. One by one, The Lawson sons grew and took up the shape of their own lives, and the table shifted to accommodate fewer places when the older ones were elsewhere, fuller again when they came back for Christmas and harvests and the great seasonal rhythms of ranch life. Harriet set the table differently across the years, sometimes 7, sometimes 11, sometimes 4, sometimes the full and glorious overflow of the holidays when grandchildren began to appear, and the original 13 was no longer adequate, and they added leaves from the back room, extending the table out into the middle of the room, because there was no longer any other way to contain the life that had grown from it. Elias grew into a young man who was, by everyone's accounting, the best of both of them, Seth's steadiness, Harriet's directness, the combined effect of which produced a person of remarkable capability and honesty who was entirely his own. He was the one who stayed closest to home as the years went on, who was most invested in the ranch itself, who worked alongside his parents with an intuitive understanding of the land and the animals that reminded Seth, watching him, of himself at that age, and reminded Harriet of something in the way he gave his full attention to whatever was in front of him. Clara, the youngest, was a force entirely her own from the beginning. She had the Lawson height and the Vaughn stubbornness, and an intelligence that ran in all directions at once and needed as much feeding as any of the cattle. She read everything Caleb sent home. She asked every question that occurred to her, which was many. She had her grandmother's name, and it turned out her grandmother's qualities, Clara Henderson, who came to supper at the ranch with the frequency of family, who watched Clara Lawson grow with an expression of absolute proprietary delight, who said more than once that she had known from the beginning. She had simply known. On a Sunday evening in the autumn of 1885, 7 years after Harriet had ridden into Caldwell on a borrowed mule, the table was set for 15. The full original 13 Seth, Harriet, and 12 sons plus Alma, Thomas's wife, and Pearl, Marcus's wife, who had both joined the family that year. Rosa was expected the following spring, Daniel having finally, at 24, made good on what everyone in the valley had seen coming for 2 years. Elias was 6, old enough for the full table, sitting in the middle of the bench with the precise dignity of a child who understands that his position at the table is a serious one. Clara, 4 years old, was between Harriet and Harriet's right hand, a location she had claimed as her own from the time she could pull herself into a chair, already a person with strong opinions about her place in things. Seth, at the head of the table, looked down its full length, the faces, the hands reaching for bread, the overlapping conversations, the noise, the particular dense, warm, beautiful noise of a family at supper. He looked at Harriet at the other end, who was listening to Samuel describe something with both hands, one ear on Samuel and one eye on Clara, and one small portion of her attention, as always, tracking the whole room. She looked up, as she sometimes did, sensing his eyes across the length of the table. He raised his cup to her. She raised hers back. It was the quietest possible thing, noticed by no one except maybe Thomas, who was sitting close to his father and who had noticed everything since he was old enough to notice, and who looked at his father's face in that moment with the same expression he had worn once at a garden fence, open and grateful, and something beyond both of those, the look of a person who has watched something be lost, and then, against the reasonable expectations of the world, be found again. The meal went on. The conversations continued. The bread was passed and the beef was passed and the coffee was poured and the children demanded attention and received it, and outside the window the prairie ran its full distance in the dark under a sky dense with stars. The same sky, the same distance, the same ancient ongoing country, and in the warm light of the house the table held all of it. Harriet Vaughn, who had ridden into Caldwell with a carpetbag and an advertisement she had answered 3 times before she trusted it, who had walked into a house where a table sat empty under 3 years of grief, who had set a place at that table for herself, and set all the other places back to rights with the same quiet, deliberate care, she brought to everything worth tending. Leaned back in her chair at the end of the meal and listened to the sound of her family and felt something she had no adequate word for, not happiness exactly, not satisfaction exactly, not love exactly, though it was all of those things together in an amount that exceeded any single container. It was home. The word she had not had a referent for in 3 years. The word that had been a thing she used to have and then didn't. It was home in the fullest and most earned meaning of the word, not the place you start but the place you build, the place you arrive at by the long specific way of your own particular life, the place that fits you because you made it fit. Seth came to find her after the table was cleared and the boys were occupied or in bed, as he did every evening, the private portion of the day that they had made their own. He stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at her with the look that was still, after 7 years, the same look, that dark and complicated brown gaze, full of the quality of knowing and being known, of all the history and all the present and all the plans forward. "William is trying to teach Elias to carry a stick correctly," he said. "I thought you should know," Harriet laughed. "Is there a correct way?" "According to William, there is an entire method," Seth said, coming into the room, sitting down at the table beside her. "He spent 20 minutes on it this evening. He is going to be a very good teacher," she said. "He gets that from you," Seth said. She looked at him. He was watching her in the way that never entirely lost its ability to catch her, that full, present, nothing-held-back attention. She had once thought in the early days that the quality of stillness in him was distance. She had come to understand it was the opposite. It was the stillness of someone who was entirely there, who had committed all of himself to the moment and wasn't going anywhere. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he confirmed. "Are you glad?" she said. Not insecurely, she knew the answer. She asked it because she liked to hear it. Seth reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the same large, careful hands, the hands of building and tending and repair. "Every single morning," he said, "before I open my eyes, before I know what day it is or what needs doing, I'm glad before anything else." She turned her hand under his and held it. Outside, in the dark yard from the direction of the bunkhouse, there was the sound of William's voice, patient and instructional, presumably explaining the correct grip on a stick, and then Elia's voice saying something, and then a pause, and then both voices together in the same laughter, the young, bright laughter of children who are safe and known and loved entirely. Seth and Harriet sat at the table he had built for a full life and listened to the sound of the full life it contained, and above the ranch and above the valley and above the endless, unbroken face of the Kansas plain, the stars burned on in their old and steady way, and everything that needed to be was exactly as it should be.